The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in July 1932, hand-delivered to sharecroppers' cabins across Macon County, Alabama, printed on official United States Public Health Service letterhead that gave it an authority most recipients couldn't read but recognized as important. You have been specially selected, it began, to receive free medical examinations and treatment from the government. This is your opportunity to receive the best healthcare available, provided at no cost to you and your family. For black men living in one of America's poorest counties during the Great Depression, men who'd never seen a doctor because they couldn't afford one, men suffering from ailments they'd endured in silence because medical care was a luxury reserved for white people, this letter seemed like a miracle, a chance to be examined by real doctors, to receive real treatment, to access a healthcare system that had always excluded them. 600 men responded to the invitation, grateful for the opportunity, trusting that their government wanted to help them. They were about to become subjects in one of the most unethical medical experiments in human history, a study that would continue for 40 years, that would deliberately withhold treatment from men dying of a curable disease, that would lie to participants about their condition and their care, that would stand as permanent proof that medical racism wasn't just neglect but active, systematic, government-sanctioned harm. This is the story of the Tuskegee syphilis study, officially titled Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, a project that began in 1932 and wasn't terminated until 1972 when a whistleblower's revelation created a public scandal so explosive that it forced the government to admit what it had been doing for 4 decades. It's about the doctors who designed the study believing that black men's bodies were fundamentally different from white men's, that syphilis progressed differently in the Negro, and therefore observing its natural course without treatment would yield valuable scientific data. About the nurses who became trusted figures in the black community while administering placebos and worthless procedures to men who thought they were receiving real medical care. About the participants who died agonizing deaths from a disease that had been curable since 1947, who infected their wives, who infected their children with congenital syphilis, who trusted their government and medical establishment until the day they died never knowing they'd been deliberately sacrificed for research. About the Public Health Service officials who renewed funding year after year, who blocked participants from receiving treatment even when it became freely available, who watched men go blind and insane and paralyzed and justified it all as necessary science. And about the legacy that persists today in the profound distrust of medical institutions within black communities, the vaccine hesitancy and clinical trial avoidance that can be traced directly to Tuskegee, the generational trauma created when the very institutions meant to protect public health became instruments of racist exploitation. The study's origins were rooted in scientific racism that was mainstream in 1930s American medicine, the widespread belief among white doctors and researchers that different races had fundamentally different biology, that diseases affected black and white bodies differently, that studying the Negro required separate research because findings from white populations couldn't be generalized across racial lines. Syphilis, a sexually transmitted bacterial infection that progresses through stages from initial sores to systemic organ damage to neurological deterioration if left untreated, was particularly racialized in medical thinking. White doctors theorized that syphilis affected the cardiovascular system more severely in black patients while affecting the neurological system more severely in white patients, a supposed racial difference that had no scientific basis but was accepted as fact by the medical establishment. The Tuskegee study was designed to test this racist hypothesis by observing what happened to black men with syphilis who received no treatment whatsoever, comparing the progression of their disease to historical data from white patients. The study was framed as beneficial to the black community, as research that would illuminate health disparities and potentially lead to better treatment, but the methodology revealed its true nature. It required denying treatment to dying men so researchers could document exactly how syphilis killed them. Macon County, Alabama was selected because it had the highest syphilis infection rate in the nation, poverty and lack of medical access having created conditions where the disease spread unchecked through the population. The Public Health Service partnered with Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university founded by Booker T. Washington, lending the study credibility within the black community and providing access to local populations who trusted the institution. 600 men were recruited between 1932 and 1933, told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a catch-all term used in the rural South to describe various ailments including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. The men were never told they had syphilis specifically, were never informed they were part of a research study, were never asked for informed consent in any meaningful sense. Of the 600 participants, 399 had syphilis while 201 served as the control group without the infection. The men with syphilis were promised free medical care, free meals on examination days, and burial insurance that would pay for their funerals when they died. This last benefit was particularly cynical because the study's purpose required participants to die. The burial insurance wasn't humanitarian concern but rather incentive to ensure researchers would gain access to bodies for autopsy, the final data collection that would document exactly what syphilis had done to their organs over decades of untreated progression. The initial procedures involved physical examinations, blood tests to confirm syphilis infection, and documentation of disease stage and symptoms. The participants believed they were receiving treatment, were told the blood draws and examinations were therapeutic interventions, were given placebos and ineffective remedies that had no medical value but maintained the fiction that they were being cared for. The study's design was observational. Researchers wanted to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis, which meant any actual treatment would contaminate the data and defeat the study's purpose. This presented an immediate ethical problem because even in 1932, treatments for syphilis existed. They weren't perfect. The standard treatment involved toxic compounds of arsenic and mercury that had serious side effects and weren't always effective, but they offered the possibility of cure or at least slowing disease progression. The Tuskegee researchers deliberately withheld these treatments from participants, justified it by arguing the treatments were dangerous and often ineffective anyway, conveniently ignored that the decision about whether to accept treatment risks should have belonged to the patients rather than researchers who decided these black men's lives were worth less than scientific data. The racist paternalism was explicit in study documents that described participants as too ignorant to understand their condition, too poor to afford treatment elsewhere, too grateful for the attention and small benefits to question what was being done to them. The study continued through the 1930s and into the 1940s with regular examinations documenting syphilis progression, researchers publishing papers in medical journals describing cardiovascular damage and neurological symptoms, the Public Health Service considering the study a success because it was generating the racial comparison data they'd wanted. Then, in 1947, everything changed. Penicillin was proven effective as a cure for syphilis, transforming the disease from chronic progressive illness to easily treatable infection. This should have ended the Tuskegee study immediately because its premise, observing untreated syphilis, became unethical in a new and undeniable way once effective treatment existed. But instead of terminating the study and offering participants the cure that could save their lives, the researchers made an active decision to continue, to keep the men ignorant of penicillin's availability, to prevent them from accessing treatment that was becoming standard care across America. The justification was scientific. After 15 years of data collection, stopping now would waste all the research already conducted. The study would only reach its full value if continued until participants died and could be autopsied. The underlying calculation was that these black men's lives mattered less than completing the research, that medical science's advancement justified sacrificing people who'd already been sacrificed for 15 years and whose deaths would at least generate publishable data. The mechanisms of treatment denial were systematic and shocking in their deliberateness. When the Public Health Service established rapid treatment centers across the South in the 1940s to treat syphilis with penicillin, Tuskegee study participants were deliberately excluded, researchers working with local health departments to ensure these specific men didn't receive the treatment being offered to everyone else. When men tried to enlist in World War II, military service that would have required syphilis treatment as part of induction physicals, study researchers intervened to ensure they were rejected or, if accepted, that treatment was withheld. When participants sought treatment independently from other doctors, the study nurses, respected figures in the community who participants trusted implicitly, discouraged them, said the treatments were unnecessary or dangerous, redirected them back to the study's worthless placebos. This required active conspiracy among dozens of medical professionals over decades, nurses and doctors and administrators who all knew they were watching men die from a curable disease and who all made daily choices to maintain the deception, to prioritize research completion over human life, to participate in what could only be described as a slow-motion medical murder conducted with forms and examinations and published papers rather than weapons. The participants' experiences varied depending on their stage of infection when recruited and how aggressively the disease progressed, but the common thread was suffering that could have been prevented. Men went blind from ocular syphilis, the bacteria destroying optic nerves, rendering them unable to work or care for themselves, dependent on families who couldn't understand why the government doctors couldn't cure this. Men developed neurosyphilis, the infection spreading to the brain and spinal cord, causing dementia, paralysis, excruciating pain that had them begging for relief that never came. Men's hearts were destroyed by cardiovascular syphilis, the bacteria weakening arterial walls until aortas ruptured in catastrophic bleeds that killed them in minutes. And through it all, they attended their regular study appointments, submitted to examinations where doctors documented the progression of their disease with clinical detachment, received their compensation of free meals and occasional aspirin, never knowing that the men in white coats measuring their deterioration had the cure and were choosing not to provide it. The wives and children who contracted syphilis from infected participants were collateral damage the researchers documented but didn't prevent. Women developed the same progressive symptoms as their husbands. Babies were born with congenital syphilis causing deformities and developmental disabilities and early death. Entire families destroyed by a disease that penicillin could have stopped with a single injection. The study's continuation through the 1950s and 1960s became increasingly difficult to justify even by the racist standards of mid-century American medicine because civil rights movements were challenging the assumption that Black lives mattered less, because medical ethics were evolving toward requirements of informed consent and patient autonomy, because the gap between what the Tuskegee participants were receiving and standard medical care was becoming too obvious to ignore. Yet the study persisted, protected by institutional inertia and the career investments of researchers who'd built reputations on this work, who'd published dozens of papers analyzing the data, who viewed terminating the study as admitting their entire careers had been built on unethical foundations they preferred not to acknowledge. The Public Health Service convened multiple reviews of the study throughout the 1960s, panels of doctors and ethicists examining the methodology and considering whether it should continue. Every review concluded the same thing. The study was providing valuable data. The participants were receiving some medical care even if not treatment for syphilis specifically. Terminating now would waste decades of research, and besides, the men were all going to die eventually, so why not extract whatever scientific value could be obtained from their deaths? The racism was implicit but unmistakable. These conclusions were only possible if you believed Black men's lives had instrumental value for science but not inherent value as human beings deserving of care and dignity. The end came not through internal ethical reckoning but through external exposure. A whistleblower who couldn't stay silent when everyone else had decided that silence was professionally expedient. Peter Buxton was a venereal disease investigator for the Public Health Service who learned about the Tuskegee study in 1966 and was immediately horrified, recognized it as a profound ethical violation, and began raising concerns through official channels. He filed formal complaints with his superiors, argued that the study violated basic medical ethics, pointed out that the participants had never consented to being research subjects and were being denied life-saving treatment. His complaints were dismissed. He was told the study was too important to stop, that he didn't understand the scientific value, that raising these concerns publicly would damage his career. Buxton persisted for 6 years, filing repeated complaints, attending meetings where senior public health service officials defended the study, being stonewalled at every level by an institution that had invested 40 years in this research and wasn't going to abandon it because one low-level employee had ethical qualms. Finally, in 1972, after exhausting all internal options, Buxton made a decision that would end his public health service career but would also end the Tuskegee study. He contacted a reporter. Gene Heller, an Associated Press journalist, received Buxton's information and spent months investigating, confirming the details, interviewing participants who still didn't know they'd been part of an experiment, documenting the systematic deception that had continued for 4 decades. Her story broke on July 25, 1972, with a headline that shocked the nation. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The article detailed how the government had deliberately withheld treatment from hundreds of Black men, had lied to them about their care, had watched them die from a curable disease in the name of research. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. This wasn't abstract medical ethics debate but a concrete atrocity. American citizens subjected to Nazi-style experimentation by their own government. Racism made visible through systematic medical abuse that couldn't be explained away or justified. The Public Health Service tried to defend the study, issued statements about its scientific value and the standards of its era, but the defense crumbled under moral clarity that transcended technical arguments about research methodology. Within days, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare terminated the study, offered treatment to surviving participants, and initiated an investigation into how this had been allowed to continue for so long. The investigation revealed the bureaucratic banality of evil that had sustained the study, not a conspiracy of cartoon villains but rather a system of ordinary professionals making incremental decisions that collectively produced extraordinary harm. The doctors who examined participants weren't sadistic monsters but career researchers who'd convinced themselves they were conducting important science, who'd rationalized the ethics because acknowledging what they were really doing would have required abandoning work they'd invested decades in. The nurses who administered placebos and discouraged treatment seeking were respected community members who'd been taught that following medical authority was their professional duty. who'd suppressed their moral qualms because questioning the study would have meant losing their jobs and the respect they'd earned. The administrators who renewed funding and blocked treatment access were bureaucrats optimizing for institutional priorities, completing studies, publishing papers, maintaining programs that reflected well on the public health service, who'd stopped seeing participants as human beings and started seeing them as data points whose value was realized through death and autopsy. The system had no single point of failure, no moment where one person's different decision would have stopped everything, which made it simultaneously everyone's responsibility and no one's fault, a diffusion of accountability that allowed the study to continue long past the point where any individual participant should have triggered intervention. The survivors, 74 men, were still alive when the study ended in 1972, though many were suffering from advanced syphilis damage that treatment could no longer reverse, experienced the revelation with complex emotions that defied simple categorization. Some expressed betrayal and rage, felt violated by the doctors they'd trusted, demanded accountability for the lies and the deaths. Others were confused, still didn't fully understand what had been done to them, processed the information through frameworks of medical authority and racial subordination that made questioning white doctors feel impossible even when told those doctors had been harming them. Still others exhibited a tragic acceptance, said they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't felt they had the power to demand better, had internalized the racism that made their suffering seem inevitable and their complaints seem ungrateful. Herman Shaw, one of the study's survivors, later testified before Congress about his experience. "We trusted the government, trusted the doctors, trusted that when they said they were helping us, they were telling the truth. We were poor black men in Alabama. Who were we to question white doctors working for the government? They gave us free meals, paid for our funerals when we died, treated us with more respect than we usually got from white people. How were we supposed to know that respect was a lie, that they were watching us die to gather their data?" The class action lawsuit filed by survivors and families of deceased participants was settled in 1974 for $10 million, approximately $37,500 per living participant and $15,000 per heir of deceased participants, amounts that were simultaneously substantial compensation for people who'd lived in poverty and grossly inadequate given 40 years of deliberate medical harm. The settlement included lifetime medical care for survivors and their families, treatment for syphilis and any related conditions, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that stopped short of full accountability because the government lawyers carefully avoided language that would set precedents for future medical malpractice claims. The money didn't restore health to men whose organs had been destroyed by decades of untreated syphilis, didn't return the dead to life, didn't undo the trauma of discovering they'd been deceived by the very institutions meant to protect them. But it was something, a material recognition that wrong had been done, that compensation was owed, that the government bore responsibility even if individual doctors and administrators would never face criminal prosecution or professional consequences proportionate to their actions. The policy responses attempted to ensure this could never happen again through institutional reforms that addressed the specific failures Tuskegee had exposed. The National Research Act of 1974 created institutional review boards to evaluate research ethics before studies could proceed, required informed consent from all research participants, mandated special protections for vulnerable populations including prisoners and the mentally disabled and people in communities with limited healthcare access. The Belmont Report in 1979 established 3 core principles for ethical research: respect for persons requiring autonomous informed consent, beneficence requiring that research maximize benefits and minimize harms, and justice requiring that research burdens and benefits be distributed fairly rather than concentrated among vulnerable populations who bear risks while others gain benefits. These reforms transformed American medical research, made studies like Tuskegee structurally more difficult to conduct because they required multiple layers of review and approval, embedded ethical oversight into research infrastructure rather than relying on individual researchers' moral judgment. But they couldn't undo the damage already done, couldn't restore trust that had been systematically destroyed, couldn't address the deeper racism that had made Tuskegee possible and that persisted in medical institutions even after the most egregious abuses were prohibited. The legacy of Tuskegee extends far beyond the specific participants and their families into generational trauma that shapes Black Americans' relationship with medical institutions today. The study created, or more accurately, confirmed and amplified, a well-founded distrust of medical research, doctors, and public health initiatives that persists 70 years after the study began and 50 years after it ended. This manifests in lower participation rates in clinical trials among Black Americans, higher skepticism toward vaccines and preventive medicine, reluctance to seek care even when symptoms are serious, and preference for alternative medicine and community healers over institutional healthcare. Public health officials often characterize this as irrational behavior, as health illiteracy that needs to be corrected through education, But that framing misses the essential point. The distrust is rational, is based on historical evidence that medical institutions have harmed black people systematically and deliberately, is a protective adaptation to institutions that have repeatedly proven they value black bodies more as research subjects than as patients deserving care. The Tuskegee study proved that the government would lie to black people about medical care, would experiment on them without consent, would watch them die when treatment existed, and would continue doing this for 40 years despite multiple opportunities to stop. Given that history, questioning medical authority isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. This distrust has contemporary public health consequences that are both understandable and tragic because they create situations where protecting oneself from institutional betrayal means foregoing beneficial medical interventions. During the COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine hesitancy was significantly higher in black communities, with Tuskegee frequently cited as reason for skepticism about government assurances that the vaccines were safe and effective. Public health officials struggled to address these concerns because they required acknowledging institutional failures and racism that the same institutions were reluctant to fully confront. Saying, "Trust us this time, we've learned from Tuskegee," rang hollow when black Americans could point to ongoing disparities in medical care, to the higher maternal mortality rates that show black women are still not receiving equal treatment, to the pain management disparities where black patients' reports of pain are systematically discredited by white doctors, to the organ transplant waitlist disparities where black patients wait longer and die more often than white patients with similar conditions. Tuskegee wasn't an isolated historical aberration but rather the most extreme example of medical racism that continues in less dramatic but still harmful forms, which makes it reasonable to question whether institutions that haven't fully addressed their racism should be trusted with your health. The formal apology came 25 years late, on May 16, 1997, when President Bill Clinton held a ceremony at the White House to acknowledge the government's wrongdoing and apologize to the 8 surviving Tuskegee study participants who were still alive. Clinton's statement was explicit and unequivocal in ways that government apologies rarely are. The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. To the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren, I say what you know. No power on earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone. But we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. The survivors present at the ceremony received the apology with dignity and grace that their treatment had never earned, Herman Shaw responding. I'm glad that President Clinton is man enough to say he's sorry for what was done to us. We appreciate that, but we can't forget what happened. We have to make sure it never happens again to anybody, regardless of their race or poverty or education. The educational legacy of Tuskegee in medical schools and public health programs attempts to ensure future doctors and researchers understand the ethical catastrophe and its causes, but the effectiveness of this education is debated. Medical students study Tuskegee as the paradigmatic example of research ethics violations, analyze what went wrong, discuss how informed consent and institutional review boards prevent similar abuses. But critics argue this treatment often frames Tuskegee as a historical aberration, a product of a more racist past that contemporary medicine has evolved beyond, rather than acknowledging the continuities of medical racism that persist in less obvious forms. Teaching Tuskegee as, "Look how far we've come," is comforting for medical students who want to believe they'd never participate in such atrocities, but it may be less effective than teaching it as, "Look how easy it is for ordinary professionals to rationalize harm," which would require uncomfortable self-examination about whether students themselves harbor unconscious biases, whether their institutions still systematically disadvantage certain populations, whether the ethical principles they're learning will actually guide their behavior when following those principles conflicts with career advancement or institutional pressures. The participants who died during the study, at least 128 men died directly from syphilis or related complications between 1932 and 1972, though the exact number is disputed because some deaths weren't adequately documented and the line between dying from syphilis versus dying with syphilis is sometimes unclear. Never received individual recognition or memorialization proportionate to what was done to them. Their names appear in research papers as case numbers, in settlement documents as line items, in historical accounts as statistics. The Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics in Research and Healthcare maintains archives and educational programs about the study, serving as memorial and warning simultaneously, but there's no national monument, no widely visited historical site, no cultural memory embedded in American consciousness comparable to other atrocities the nation has acknowledged. This absence is itself revealing. Tuskegee is taught as medical ethics lesson but not commemorated as American tragedy, framed as a cautionary tale for researchers but not as a profound betrayal of citizens by their government, remembered institutionally but not nationally in ways that would require confronting ongoing medical racism rather than just condemning its historical manifestations. The doctors and researchers who conducted the study faced no criminal prosecution, no professional sanctions, no consequences beyond the reputational damage of having their work exposed as unethical. Most had retired by 1972 when the study ended, their careers complete, their papers published, their professional standing secure. Some expressed regret in later interviews, said they'd been products of their time, argued that ethical standards had evolved and it wasn't fair to judge them by contemporary values. Others defended the study even after exposure, insisted it had generated valuable scientific data, claimed the participants would have died from syphilis anyway because they couldn't have afforded treatment, revealed through these defenses how deeply they'd internalized the racist assumptions that made Tuskegee possible. The nurse who became most associated with the study, Eunice Rivers, a black nurse who served as the primary interface between researchers and participants for nearly 40 years, faced particular scrutiny and condemnation, criticized for enabling the abuse while also defended as someone with limited power who did what she could to provide genuine care within a racist system that constrained her options. Rivers defended her role until her death in 1986, argued she'd helped participants access what little healthcare they could get, provided compassion and dignity in their interactions with the medical system even if the underlying research was exploitative, made choices she believed were better for participants than complete abandonment would have been. Whether this defense was self-serving rationalization or genuine moral complexity depends on whether you believe Rivers had real agency to stop the study or whether she was herself trapped in a system that would have replaced her with someone less caring if she'd objected. The scientific value of the Tuskegee study, the question of whether the 40 years of research produced knowledge that advanced medical understanding of syphilis, is contested and uncomfortable because acknowledging any scientific value seems to validate the ethics of obtaining it, while dismissing the science entirely seems to require ignoring the papers that were published and cited for decades. The honest assessment is probably that the study generated some descriptive data about syphilis progression in untreated populations, confirmed that cardiovascular complications were common in late-stage disease, documented timelines of symptom development that had previously been uncertain. But this knowledge was largely redundant with existing research from other populations, didn't produce breakthroughs or treatments that couldn't have been discovered through ethical means, and was fundamentally tainted by the methodology that made any findings suspect because the study population wasn't representative of anything except systematically abused black men in extreme poverty with no access to care. The researchers wanted to believe they were conducting important science that justified the ethics, but the reality was they were producing marginal data at catastrophic human cost, prioritizing career advancement and institutional prestige over both ethics and scientific rigor. 52 years after the study's termination, the survivors and their descendants continue processing a trauma that was both individual and collective, both historical and ongoing because its effects cascade across generations and shape current experiences with medical institutions. The children born with congenital syphilis because their fathers weren't treated carry permanent disabilities that affect their entire lives. The grandchildren who grew up hearing family stories about medical betrayal approach doctors with justified suspicion that affects their health outcomes. The community that witnessed Tuskegee received a clear message about their value in American society and their relationship to institutions that claim to serve them. This generational transmission of trauma and distrust is part of Tuskegee's legacy that simple apologies and policy reforms can't address because it's embedded in community memory, passed down as protective knowledge about navigating racist institutions, reinforced by ongoing experiences of medical dismissal and disparities that confirm the lessons Tuskegee taught. The final truth about the Tuskegee syphilis study is that it wasn't an aberration or a relic of a less enlightened past but rather an extreme manifestation of assumptions about whose bodies matter, whose suffering deserves attention, whose lives have value beyond their utility to others. Those assumptions produced slavery and Jim Crow and medical experimentation on enslaved people and forced sterilization of black women in Tuskegee and the ongoing disparities that kill black Americans at higher rates from preventable diseases because the same structural racism persists even when its most dramatic expressions are prohibited. The study proved that American medical institutions could watch black people die from curable diseases for 40 years, could lie to them systematically, could recruit trusted community members to facilitate the abuse, and could face no meaningful consequences until public exposure forced minimal accountability. That proof shapes rational responses to medical authority, creates warranted skepticism that public health officials characterize as a problem to be solved through better messaging rather than a justified response to institutions that have repeatedly demonstrated they can't be trusted. Tuskegee happened because racism made it possible, continued because institutional priorities overrode ethics, ended because one whistleblower's conscience wouldn't accept the bureaucratic justifications everyone else had internalized, and persists in its effects because the underlying racism that enabled it has never been fully dismantled, just forced into less obvious forms that still harm Black Americans every day in emergency rooms and research protocols and public health initiatives that assume compliance rather than earning trust. The 600 men who were recruited in 1932 deserved better, deserved treatment, deserved truth, deserved to be treated as human beings rather than research subjects. Their betrayal stands as permanent indictment of medical institutions that claim to serve public health while sacrificing the most vulnerable to scientific curiosity and racist assumptions about whose lives mattered. Remembering Tuskegee requires more than teaching it as historical ethics lesson. It requires acknowledging the ongoing legacies, confronting the persistent racism, and understanding that trust destroyed over 40 years through systematic abuse can't be rebuilt through apologies alone but only through sustained commitment to equity, transparency, and treating Black patients with the dignity and care that was denied to those 600 men who trusted their government and paid for that trust with their lives.